talks about the war on drugs from several perspectives. Paul retired as a detective lieutenant after a 26-year career with the New Jersey State Police. For 12 of those years, Paul worked as an undercover narcotics officer. His investigations spanned the spectrum of possible cases, from street drug users and mid-level drug dealers in New Jersey to international billion-dollar drug trafficking organizations. Paul ended his undercover career living nearly 2 years in Boston and New York City, posing as a fugitive drug dealer wanted for murder while tracking members of a terrorist organization that robbed banks, planted bombs in corporate headquarters, courthouses, police stations, and airplanes, and ultimately murdered a New Jersey State trooper. So, the Executive Director of the Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, Jack Law.
That we went public with me. Since then, we've grown to over 12,000 members. We're not just cops anymore. We're cops, judges, prosecutors, prison wardens, DEA and FBI agents. You name it, we got law enforcers who are members. And we're all calling for an end to this bloody war. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you a quick history lesson on what things were like before we started the war in 1970 and what they're like today, and let you to decide whether you think this was a good policy or not. And then we'll take some questions, and then after that we'll go to solutions. You know, we didn't always have an illegal drug in the United States. On a federal level, the first time we had an illegal drug was 1914. When they passed the Harrison Anti-Drug Act, which made opiates illegal. Before that, if you had $4.85 in your pocket, as this ad from a grocery store in December of 1901 depicts, you could walk into any grocery store and buy an ounce of pure heroin. We hadn't turned into a nation of drugged-out zombies back then, and we are sure we will not turn into a nation of drugged-out zombies if we re-legalize these drugs. Down through the ages, every time somebody makes a law to prohibit another drug, it invariably has very little to do with the drug. It's almost always based on racism. When this law went into effect, it was based on racism. And the race of choice back then for us to hate was the Chinese, who we brought over to this country to build our railroads. Once they got them built, we didn't want them here anymore. But we couldn't deport them and say, hey, they're taking jobs from the real Americans, right? So we couldn't deport them, but we could arrest them if we had a law that would make that possible. And we're sure this was based on racism because the forerunner to this law, passed in California and San Francisco in 1909, simply said it's illegal for a Chinaman to possess opium. So we're pretty sure who they were aiming at. Now they took Chinaman out of it when they made the federal law, but that was okay because they realized that 99.9% of the people who possessed opium were Chinese, so it still got the job to do. That was a big step. We'd never done anything like that before, so the government wanted something to hang their hat on and say to the public, we really need this. So they said that they had done studies, and 1.3% of the population of the country was addicted to drugs. They said, we can't have that. We've got to make some of these drugs illegal. And fast forward ahead 56 years to 1970, that's where I come into it. In between there, they made a lot more drugs illegal. Actually, it was 1964 when I joined the New Jersey State Police. That picture in the upper left-hand corner is a picture of when I graduated that year. Right below it is more or less a picture of when I graduated from their narcotic bureau. So that's one of the better pictures. I try to keep the bad ones off there. The rest are just me undercover. It was 1970 when I went into the narcotic bureau. That was the beginning of the war on drugs. The war on drugs was actually coined and created by Richard Milhouse Nixon in 1968. Again, had nothing to do with drugs, guys. Had everything to do with the fact that he was running for the presidency for the second time. This time he thought it would be really nice if he could win. He knew he was a strong, if he ran as a strong anti-crime guy, he'd bring in a lot of votes, but boy, if he could be in charge of the war, how many votes for him? As we see, it works. It worked then. He was elected And again, I believe, was based mainly on racism. The reason I say that is when Nixon went to New Hampshire, as everybody does, for the first state they're going to campaign in, he did very well up there. And he wrote a letter back to his mentor, Eisenhower, saying, Ike, you know, it's unbelievable how many votes you can garner by fear. He said, all I talk about up here is drugs and crime. Everybody wants to vote for me, and they don't even have any black people up here. So you can figure out where he was going with this. He was elected. His first year in office, H.R. Haldeman, who was his chief of staff, came down and from a meeting with him, and he sat down at his desk, opened his personal diary, and he wrote in that diary, I just left a meeting with the president, and Mr. Nixon said, and he's got it in quotes, the real problem in this country is the blacks. And the trick is how to get at that problem without anyone realizing that's what's occurring. As far as I'm concerned, his answer to that conundrum was a war on drugs, because it has literally devastated the black people, which we'll get into a little bit later. All right, we date the beginning of the war on drugs from 1970, and the reason we do that is that was when it was implemented with cash. Nixon got the U.S. Congress to pass funding bills would give massive amounts of money to any police department willing to hire officers to fight this war on drugs. To give you a slight idea how big those were, when I joined the state police in 1964, we had 1,700 troopers and a 7-man narcotic unit. Always seemed perfectly adequate for the job we needed to do. 6 years later, we had those same numbers. Until October of 1970, when thanks to these federal bills, we went from a 7-man unit to a 76-person bureau in narcotics. We enlarged that by 11 times its size. Now, when you do something like that to an organization, you set up a great deal of expectation, right? Since cops are judged mainly on the amount of arrests they make, the expectation with us was that in the coming year we would arrest at least 11 times more drug offenders than we did the year before. We were off to the races. So let me tell you what occurred then. Again, this was a big step, right? A war on drugs. They had to have something to show the public that this was necessary, so they went out and they did a survey. And they discovered that 1.3% of the population was addicted to drugs. Can't have that, got to start a war. A war was probably a pretty poor policy choice, because if you go back and look at the statistics from 1970, you will find that the likelihood of anybody dying in this country as a result of the drug culture was less than the likelihood of them dying from falling down the steps in their own house. It was less than the likelihood of them dying from choking to death on their own food at dinner. Well, we started a war on drugs. We really didn't have much of a drug problem in 1970. What little problem we did have was mainly soft drugs. Marijuana, hashish, LSD, psilocybin, the mushroom, the mind-bending drugs. Hard drugs, such as heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, were virtually unheard of in 1970. Certainly unheard of compared to what they are today. And to show you how unheard of they were, I downloaded this chart from DEA's own website, 2001. You won't find it up there anymore. I think it told a little bit more than they wanted to tell. But it's a very interesting chart. It talks about the price and purity of heroin from 1980 to 1999. Running down the left-hand side is the price that it cost one heroin user to get high one time on average in each of those years. And DEA has kindly adjusted all these figures back to 1980 dollars to account for inflation, so you can see what the real change is. Running down the right-hand side is the purity of the drug that street person would have been buying at the final sale. I can back this up to 10 years. As I said, I started in 1970 buying heroin. When we bought heroin on the streets, we bought what we're calling tray bags because they cost $3 a bag. And we always bought them in multiples of 2. The reason we did that was what the heroin users did, and of course we wanted to look like heroin. The reason they bought them in multiples of 2 is they had to shoot both bags at the same time in order to get high at once. So back then it cost $6 to get high. The reason they had to shoot both bags at the same time is that I just told you hard drugs were almost unheard of. There was so little heroin to go around back then. It was called garbage drugs on the street. It was coming in at 1.5% pure.